Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, 5 Tips for a Painless Cloud Migration. I'm Emily Gedkin, Marketing Manager here at Armor and the host for today's broadcast. Before we get started, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping tips. All attendees are currently on mute and will remain so throughout the duration of the broadcast. Please use the chat window to inform us of any audio or technical issues. If there are any initial sound issues, we do recommend calling in via phone instead of audio through your computer. At the end of the webinar, we will have a question and answer portion. Please use the question feature to ask any questions you may have about the topics being discussed. Lastly, we will be recording today's webinar and an edited version will be made available post-event. With us today are Rafael Los, VP of Security at Armor, Kirk Pollack, Vice President at Motifworks, and Sujay Shivakumar, DevOps Project Engineer at Privo. Raf, at this time, I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
Thanks, and welcome everybody. This is a webinar that we're going to talk about 5 strategies to make cloud migration painless. And I think we all know by now that the companies that we all work with have started getting out to the cloud. So this is kind of both timely and relatively important for you if you're sitting in the security seat. The 3 of us will take turns kind of guiding you through the presentation we've got put together for you and the different pieces that we're all responsible for from our company perspectives. So without too much further ado, I'm going to get us started. We're going to do this in 6 stages. We're going to start with obviously the starting component of the secure cloud migration. And just so for reference that everybody's aware, we're not just covering security. We want to make sure we cover the other parts of this that support security, because if it's one thing we've learned in 20 plus years in this industry is that security on its own doesn't do a very good job supporting a business that it doesn't understand. So assessing and planning, validating, building, migrating, and ultimately optimizing are the steps that we've defined to help you get through. And again, the 3 of us, myself, Kirk, and CJ will walk you guys through this entire component. And we're going to start with this concept of secure cloud migration and why it's important. And I think that there are 3 to 5 basic components here that we need to think about. You guys are probably hearing at least a couple of these, probably all of them. And yes, it's really happening. And much like 10, 15 years ago when we walked around the office and our CISO said, no, we don't do wireless here. And you could point to any number of wireless access points plugged in under somebody's desk or on top of somebody's cube. The cloud is a very real thing. It's here. It's happening. It's a transformational thing for IT. And security really does need to understand its impact to the business and its impact to ourselves. So we ask questions like, how am I going to migrate? More importantly, what are my goals, right, from a security perspective? What are my compliance needs? Because it's not just about security from a operational perspective, it's about meeting compliance needs so the business can operate. How can I be secure and scalable? Those 2 things have historically been juxtaposed. Security has been low and slow, while scalability and the business shoots for fast and easy, right? And what resources are available to me? Because this industry, if you've looked around the last couple of years, there is no shortage of vendors, tools, processes, open source, a closed source, and everything in between, methodologies and best practices. There's a lot of that stuff going around, but what can you really depend on and what resources are really available to you trying to get your company into the cloud securely? So we're going to start off with just a very simple poll question for you all. I would love it if you all answered. There's a lot of you on this webinar. So it's very simple. How soon does your company anticipating migrating to the cloud? Go ahead and answer this poll if you wouldn't mind, and it would help us give me a little bit of a platform from which to speak from here. Whether you've already gone, currently migrating in some near future, or you are of the mindset that you don't anticipate migrating to the cloud at all, in which case I think we might have to have another discussion, but because I think every company is out there is doing something in the cloud already. So take a few moments, answer them questions while Jeopardy music plays in your head. I think from a from the perspective of experience, and Kirk, maybe you can, or CJ, maybe you guys can ad-lib for a second with me here. The vast majority of customers that I've talked to in the last 5 to 7 years have started in some form or fashion. I know very few that are going to be 100% off-prem, meaning in the cloud, but I think that there are enough that there are probably more companies that are 100% in the cloud than there are companies that aren't going to the cloud at all. Do you guys agree?
Yeah, totally. And most of our initial engagements with a lot of our clients start with some type of migration on premises to AWS, different co-location to AWS, or from a different cloud provider to AWS. So, or if they're already on AWS at this point, then it's geared more towards optimizing their workload to be more like cost efficient. Is it more scalable? And security obviously is a big thing as well, or just making sure it's overall a reliable infrastructure.
That's great input, CJ. And I think, yeah, whether AWS, Azure, or a multi-cloud strategy, I think we're seeing very similar approaches where, you know, it can be a client that first went through some sort of lift and shift or re-host exercise and are now in a motion around re-platform and re-architecture, or a modernization effort focused on a specific group of applications, custom apps, what have you, or the impending event around a compliance need or something around a contract termination or end of life hardware, which can help the IT organization drive change to the business based on a cost initiative or something of that nature.
We got that as a poll question later, which is perfect setup. But so the results for you guys here is 55% of you have said that we have already migrated some workloads, which is great. Another 27% saying that you were wanting to migrate at some point in the future. Luckily, there is a strange split of 9% and 9% to we are currently migrating versus we don't anticipate at all to migrate. So that's great that we've got that going on. It's going to be very interesting to see how we progress in terms of the next 12 to 18 months for many of you on this webinar. Hopefully that you started developing those plans and are getting ready to move the business along and or follow it along as the case may be. All right. So let's talk about assessing and planning and defining goals. And today I'm going to turn that over to you.
Great. Yeah. Raf did a great job just setting the stage for this slide deck, actually. So we've talked a lot about planning, a lot about setting priorities and knowing what your goals are, which in and of itself can be challenging. So add to the fact that you need to be HIPAA compliant or PCI compliance and becomes a whole different nightmare. Luckily, a lot of cloud providers, especially AWS, offers a lot of HIPAA eligible services. I say HIPAA eligible services because just by deploying the service, you're not automatically HIPAA compliant. But at least out of the box, you have a solution where you can deploy your services that can be HIPAA compliant in the future. So now is a good time to target your legacy applications. How do we go from a static monolithic application to a workload that is dynamically scalable? Essentially, that means that being able to have an automated CI/CD pipeline, a continuous integration and deployment pipeline, where you're utilizing auto scaling groups to spin up more servers for you that is a replica of your application when there's a spike in traffic. So different tools like that you can utilize on AWS so your legacy applications are no longer legacy. And identifying your operational burdens. I'm sure most of us have been at a place where, on premises having to encrypt disks, it's been a pain. We've probably forgotten an OS update or some patching that can be done, utilizing tools that are provided by different cloud providers and on AWS specifically, using services like Systems Manager that can essentially take care of patching automatically for you, or using Lambda for backups, which can do automated backups and cleanups for you. You obviously have to configure it, but at least it can do it for you. So you're only paying for the amount of time that you're storing your backups for. So it's an automated cleanup procedure as well. And thinking about the whole stack, so what do you guys actually currently do? Which one of your applications is currently important and is critical to your workload, and which of them can actually wait? So this is where a multi-phase approach will actually make sense. So phase one, you're moving your most critical applications over to the cloud, or your least critical applications, and then phase two, you get more familiar with the cloud. You're more familiar with your environment right now, and then you can move over your less critical items or actually your critical environment. And to summarize all of this, it's all going to come down to your team's knowledge of the cloud platform. So identify how your team learns. Are they more hands-on, we have to do a project, and once you do a project, we're good to go on with the whole infrastructure, or are they more into tutorials and training videos? Don't be scared to use outside resources like Udemy, A Cloud Guru. That's how I learned the cloud and got introduced to AWS. So feel free to use all those tools as well. And finally, just mention a couple of services that are really critical and are out of the box great services. So don't just look to make a colo in the cloud. There are so many great services that are offered that can help your application go from where it is today to the next level. So yeah, I'll just leave it. Don't just make a colo in the cloud.
I think that's a great final point to end that slide on, simply because taking a legacy workload or legacy application that's been designed for monolithic infrastructure sitting on Iron somewhere data center and just shoving it into an AWS instance or an Azure instance doesn't automatically make it more resilient or give you any of the benefits of the cloud. You have to do a little bit of work to make that, to modernize it, refactor it, build it for resilience and fault tolerance and scalability. Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the cool things with that is, there's partner programs like Privo, and I'm sure other partners that are available that can tell you about these programs. So identifying those resources, which was initially in the very first slide deck, people are out there that can also tell you about these that can, empower your application essentially.
Absolutely. So, Kirk, you want to walk us through assessment plan from your perspective?
Certainly, and appreciate the opportunity and to touch on the planning and goal setting in leading towards a strategy like this. And what I like about that previous slide, as well as the group that we have on the call, is there's a few different perspectives. And when defining goals, all of those technical, tactical components, to put some thought into, and a common theme where we've seen clients struggle is either IT is quote unquote pushing the rope to the business, or vice versa, or infrastructure is to apps to security, what have you. So how is something like operational opportunities able to be attached to a business driver or something around a performance issue that can help really sell the use case and really help the IT organization show the value of cloud and push the project forward by having engagement across the organization. So when those things are established, both from a technical and tactical perspective, it really helps in building, almost taking a enterprise architecture approach, where we have a series of strategic initiatives that are uncovered by the IT and business units, which help drive the opportunity. And in order to achieve those strategic initiatives, assessing the environment across the people, the process, and the technologies to create alignment and come up with the best path forward becomes a key component to how you execute. So in assessing an environment, I think what's really critical here and what we've seen is, how is it being assessed? So how are you approaching getting the right stakeholders involved across your organization? Making sure, as most of the folks that are security folks here are on the call, that they're engaged often and early, so that with each step, whether it's a modernization effort, an infrastructure move, or a data platform modernization effort, the right stakeholders are brought into the table early. And then from that learning perspective, teaching the team to fish while executing, so that folks are getting out of their own way, focused on the day-to-day responsibilities without things getting blocked out. So if you execute an assessment in an effective way, you're going to end up with the proper insights around business case, strategy, the people and process, and the technology associated. And then you're able to wrap those together in a useful deliverable that, whether you're presenting to an IT organization or the business stakeholders, it speaks their language and enables the organization to have a path forward. Once that path is complete, or in parallel to that, what we've seen to be most successful is, while assessing the environment, begin to identify those pilot candidates and execute the education and learning experience while completing a pilot exercise. So as you complete the deliverable and present to your executive board, you have a working use case that can then be replicated or adjusted and adapted based on budget, what worked, what didn't. And then you're really creating that repeatable framework for execution of a migration. So in conjunction with that, and Raf, did you kind of want to touch on how the security assessment would tie into the overarching assessment of the environment to execute on near-term and long-term success?
Yes, I would. Thanks, Kirk. And so very simply, right, from an Armor perspective, there's a lot of places that we as an organization can help you guys listening jump in. Understanding what your overall goals are from a consultative perspective, that's what one of the things we staff is not just folks that know our products and services, but they actually have industry experience that understand where you've been likely have been in your seat before and sort of know the challenges, know the issues. And being able to do an assessment of the environment, both of your on-prem and then one of the 3 public clouds that you're going into as you start migrating things in, because odds are you're already, like, as you guys indicated during the poll, you're already, some way in, right? So that means that the developers or architects or engineers or some part of your organization has already started moving things into the cloud. To know what state it's in is important, right? Because you don't really know where you can't really figure out a path forward until you know where you're standing or what your posture is, good or bad. So being able to identify those risks through an assessment tool and an actual approach, whether it's leveraging AWS's well-architected framework, or you're looking at the brand new just released Microsoft Azure framework and best practices as well. It was literally released yesterday as you're listening to this. And to be able to go through that and help you understand the things that you're missing, that you're not thinking about, or sort of what is the recommended practice, where should you have things done. So, and from a helping a delivery perspective, obviously, as you create your pilots, create your test cases, go ahead and try some of these things out. We're there alongside you to be able to identify and cooperatively deploy with you in sort of test instances and make sure that things work the way that you're expecting them, meeting your needs. So that said, Kirk, you want to give us a real case study? Because this is kind of interesting.
Absolutely. And just a thought popped in my head as you were talking, Ralph. If you really look at AWS and Azure and the most known public cloud providers, they've really become advanced commodities, right? So, each organization based on different capabilities and preference is going to choose, a cloud or a multi-cloud strategy, and really alignment with internal resources and the right partners to help execute is really where the difference is and where adoption is going to derive from. So, taking time to really evaluate the capabilities of the partners you are currently working with and potential new partners, and how they can actually provide deep insight of what you have and can help you execute, I think is really where we see clients, have success, and that's across whichever cloud you end up preferring. Now, in this particular use case, we're working with a large financial services, insurance, wealth management organization, about 6,000 users at this point and growing. You had an IT organization, security also on board, that really wanted to become cloud native. So if you saw that CCOE, the Cloud Center of Excellence note on the previous slide, that was kind of where this group was driving to. They had come under one brand on a commercial level, but not in IT. They were siloed out. So every time they bought a new small company, which was 1 to 2 per week, they were running into serious compliance issues from both a cost and a security posture perspective. So what was happening was, when they bought these companies, their clients would want a new compliance audit every single time an acquisition happened, which, as you can imagine, become timely, expensive, and very difficult to manage. So IT used that with security as a driver to push the business towards helping them achieve their goal of becoming cloud native. So in executing this engagement, Motifworks has some specific IP that creates interactive dashboards and analysis of an existing environment. We're able to complete that assessment in 6 weeks or less and execute on the kind of pilot migration of one of these small data centers in less than 90 days. So that provided a business case, cost advantages. It was actually an incentive provided by Microsoft to support that as well. We provided these dashboards, which gave them reports around the costs, the savings, the different opportunities based on contracting models within Azure, as well as detailed analysis around the level of effort, risk, and complexity and what the near-term opportunities were to migrate. Once that was complete in less than 90 days, they were able to present to the business the outcome in a successful way, which has led to ongoing work where we are now integrating on a wave-based basis a backlog of these acquired companies, which they buy 1 to 2 per week. And this has now evolved into a couple of different areas. One, that optimization story of what's been lifted and shifted is now being optimized. Secondly, after going through a lift and shift approach with their acquired companies, they are now taking a little different track of a re-platforming and re-architecture from an app modernization perspective of their enterprise data centers, which are happening now. And in parallel to that, we're now also working with them on things around data platform. So how can we take our existing data environment, things like data, or how can we move to things like Azure Data Factory in a successful way without impacting the business? So we're about 1.5 years into a 4-year plan that will move all of their data centers into the cloud. They are near term becoming cloud native, and tying into that is working closely with Armor to assist in each step of the way, making sure that what's new and what's changed aligns with the appropriate security posture so that they're remaining compliant within Azure and eliminating those costs and challenges associated with the acquisitions that are happening basically on a nonstop basis. So that would kind of be the short of that example, and a great example of how if you take the right steps in the beginning and then repeat them over time, that your success rate continues and adoption is maintained and tends to actually have hockey stick growth because there's repeatable success based on the activities and approach taken in the beginning. Ralph, anything you'd like to add?
No, I think that if I added anything to it, only detract. Well done. I think it's a great way to look at this in terms of how to actually do something like this. And you know, when you go assess from a full life cycle, right, from the assessment into the migration, and doing it at a very large scale with that very specific use case. I think that's a great way to talk about it.
And real quick, it's just so
yeah.
An interesting point that just popped in my head. It's almost assess and reassess. Like we actually have a call with them later this afternoon focused on that app modernization effort tied to some Kubernetes work. And we will actually be doing another incentivized program through Microsoft to reassess that environment since it's been 9 months, which is an excellent practice, especially when, and Sujay had mentioned this as well. Multiple cloud providers offer, if you're with the right partners, different incentive programs. So capitalize on that and take the opportunity to reevaluate, reassess, and adjust and adapt based on the change that is inevitably going to happen over the course of a year to the environment. So that was just something I thought would be worth adding.
That is definitely worth adding. So let's talk to validate, you guys, because validation is an important step to get you past the I have an idea, let's make sure it works. I'll hand it back over to you, Kirk, because I think this is another one of those areas of expertise of yours.
Yeah, well, and I think this is the validate part and the POC component. It's something we really drove and had great success with helping with clients convert into cloud. And what we had seen from other partners and just challenges companies were having was that they were kind of focused just on an assessment, right? So if that's the case, you can sometimes hit some brick walls. So in validating, it's while we're doing this assessment, based on that initial slide that Sujay had talked about, what can we identify where there's a business priority, and let's focus on that as a pilot candidate. And executing the pilot, either in parallel or following the assessment, you're really creating an adoption program. So by assessing the environment, that's the obvious business case. In executing the pilot, you're supporting the business case and gaining experience in what does it take to really move to the cloud? How do I scale this? So by identifying a priority workload or application or data platform, executing on that, learning from it, and then validating a multi-cloud or particular cloud as your platform of choice really knocks out or puts a lot of checks in the box to set the stage for a larger scale migration that you'll hear me say over and over again that will be repeatable and successful. So what did we learn? What worked? What didn't? How do we adapt? And then how do we execute from here? And in turn, doing that in a way that's often incentivized by one of the cloud providers helps offset that cost and helps you execute if you're trying to make this happen out of line with your budgeting cycling. So you're ready to go, and you can have some insights. So when budget planning happens, the larger scale discussion is easier to have.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that, that during this process, there are so many things that people usually identify that they did not know were dependencies. And those are key, essentially, when it comes to planning how your infrastructure is going to look on the cloud. So just recently, we had a client who did not fully understand their dependencies with other services that they were using. So that all comes up from, this whole phase of finding out and developing and validating our whole POC. That way, you're better prepared as you move to the cloud.
That's a great point. I think a really interesting example there is, there's a big push around SQL 2008 and Windows 2008 end of support. Hey, you can move that and extend support by moving to Azure, for example. But the reality of that, sure, let's lift and shift that, but what about all the dependencies? So in doing a POC, the focus can be more on finding the right landing spot, be that IaaS, be that SQL PaaS, be that SQL managed instance, or something that's available in AWS as well, and executing on something like this to really figure out what the readiness is, the compatibility is, and how do we think about this at an application level, so that we're not just moving something and it fails because we didn't think about all the things that are connected to it. So great insight, Sujay. Thank you.
Yeah, and you guys, this thing extends far beyond, into security, primarily because so many of the on-premise security infrastructures and processes that we have and tools that we have simply don't carry over well. And as some of the lessons that we've learned, I think all three of us have learned over the getting a tool that you have that works great where you have control. Everything is very monolithic and very much on premise, or at least under your control directly down to the iron is great, but you try to migrate that. And one of the first things I think that we can all chuckle about that we learned is when we had to go do forensics, for example, right? Set our environments up to do forensics. It wasn't as simple as going to pull a drive out and keeping a copy of that disk, because whether you're in Amazon or Azure or Google Cloud or someplace else, it's not as simple as walking into a data center and pulling some disk out. So when it comes to POCs and being able to create that proof of concept to make sure that your ideas are validated and actually working, dropping those environments is important, especially with flexibility. Security has to be able to not take up an entire, let's talk about licensing for a second, take up an entire license just because you have a POC environment for 15, 20 minutes at a time, right? So it's important to have that kind of flexibility in your security. And I think that's someplace that we all need to think about going. So I got another poll question for you all. What percentage of your IT infrastructure do you anticipate putting in the cloud? And again, another, as we alluded to earlier, I think that the extremes of all or none are very, very rare. And I think that Kirk and Sujay, maybe you guys can give me a little commentary on this. The ones that have all are typically those kind of brand new startups, don't want to worry about legacy or want to have anything in a desk or a closet somewhere. And those that are moving have none, I think we call those dinosaurs because they're going to go probably that same route. Very few companies have some sort of mandate or requirement. Even the federal government and state governments are moving stuff out. Do you guys see it much that's not migrating at all?
Well, the one trend we're seeing is, and it kind of ties to your previous statement, is those that have been through some exercises with varying degrees of success are looking at, okay, what data center are we using to have, old core legacy core systems and application to go to die, right, to retire? And are we taking, we've been through a rehost exercise, it worked, but could have been better. It was, there were more dependencies, what have you. So let's take a more modernization approach on an application by application basis And then we're focused more on a data migration than trying to, like you had alluded to earlier in previous slides, than just have a colo in the cloud. So that would be one trend we see. I think when you see a low percentage of cloud adoption, it's less about the technology and it's more about getting people on board or alignment across the organization. And the only other part that would tie into that is some sort of core app that is not cloud ready in some way, shape, or form, which, you know, the way industries are changing, you know, the way we're seeing it is whether that's in FinServe or legal, you know, more and more of that stuff is going to be cloud enabled in the next, you know, anywhere from 6 to 18 months. So I think what you're saying is spot on. And we're having more conversations on how to best move than are we moving, are we not moving across multiple verticals at this point.
Well, the good news is I got the results back. And what percentage of your IT infrastructure do you anticipate putting in the cloud? As we sort of predicted, the winner heads and shoulders is 25 to 49%. So you're putting something out there. 23% of you all said there's less than 25%. 15% said between 50 and 75, and a whopping 23% anticipate putting more than 75% of their IT infrastructure in some sort of cloud. And I think that it makes all the sense in the world to talk about security right now, right here, more than any time before, because if you're already on that path, as we've learned again over the last 20 some odd years, security can't just show up later and retrofit. It simply does not work. The cloud will absolutely enable IT to completely forget about you and have one of those, what we call for security analysts and CISOs, resume updating events. So as we move along here, we're going to talk a little bit about the next component of this, and that is the build. If I can get my slides to switch here.
Great. Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah, we see it now. Excellent. I think we can all agree that the build process is probably one of the most important processes in migrating to the cloud. The next slide that we're going to look at over here is just going to go through the life cycle of a complete build process for migration to the cloud. And we'll see this word be thrown out a lot about it, testing from a pilot. Essentially, it's just performing a pilot testing of your application, identifying your dependencies that we've already covered, and Kirk also talked in detail about, and knowing what your application needs to perform at its fullest capacity. And when you do that, when you have your 100% of your utilization against your application, against your current environment, you also assess the cost. Hey, this is what I need to scope out my AWS servers or my Azure providers, the capacity of my servers, my databases, et cetera, to be able to support my current user base. And similarly, you also establish monitoring tools, which are going to give you specific downright metrics that will also allow you to have a right cost estimate as well. Talk a lot. Communication is key in this whole process because it's a whole application that essentially is powering the revenue for a company, and you're moving it from your current traditional practices over to the cloud. And we come back to partner networks, right? Partners like Privo and other partners that Azure provides. We're going to be there to help out. So come up with a plan, identify what your application needs to be successful, bring it to partners, and we'll help architect that out in the cloud for you. And the rest of the phase is automate deployment, have a contingency plan, and move groups. All of these are the revisiting and re-optimization, re-architecting piece that we've covered so far. You are up and running in the cloud. What is up next? How can we get this environment, and how can we utilize all of the services that are provided that we did not essentially have access to when we were on premises, and how can we make our application even better? So that would cover the build step. But I'm sure, Raf, you guys can also contribute on how Armor can help in this process.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a thought or two on that as well. And whether it's performing a pilot, looking at costs, because that's something security's got to be very conscious of, right? It's really nice to have a security tool or platform that you can build and leverage, much like you leverage the cloud. So you shouldn't have to pay for your security any different then you pay for your the way IT consumes cloud. So that's always important, right? And that's something Armor provides. Being able to establish monitoring and reporting both from a security and compliance and best practice perspective, adherence to IT, whether your entire environment is secure and compliant or just some portion of it. I've got CISOs that I talk to that are excited about the fact that they've got fairly good protection for the workloads they know about. And I'll leave you with they know about, because the rest of them, they're like, well, I'm sure there's stuff out there. I simply don't see it. Right. So that's visibility. I can't stress enough how much visibility hurts, and you can, or lack thereof, right, hurts. And that's because you can see, look in the news and look at all the breaches, and it's usually not in the places that, you're not going to get a CISO that says, oh yeah, I totally knew about that server. I knew it was missing patches, or I knew it had a configuration mistake. We just simply didn't do it. It's almost always I didn't know that thing existed. If I had known, we could have done something about it. Right. So visibility in these processes is extremely important. Partnering, look, folks, partnering in terms of operations and security operations is extremely important, because odds are, if you're in the mid-market, you aren't able to provide yourselves the kind of staffing, the kind of tooling, the kind of expertise that you really need to make a good push at security. And if you can't do that, you don't want to depend on almost good enough, right? It's kind of like that. You never want to go to a brain surgeon. It's like, yeah, I was okay. I got through medical school. You should be fine. You want the A+ team. And so that's kind of why you partner with companies like Armor for these types of security operations and being able to defend your clouds, because you want to partner with the best, and you really want to have the A team on your side for these types of things. And whether you're moving or look, things like contingency plan, right? Migrating groups over slowly and with purpose. These are things you want somebody that's done it before, that has some expertise in, and we're certainly in a position to help you there. All right. Moving on here. Excuse me for 1 second. All right, Kirk, you want to talk through the cloud adoption and migration plan that you've got developed?
Absolutely, and this could apply to, again, a cloud agnostic, multi-cloud, AWS or Azure. Yeah, and can you flip the next slide real quick so I can, or was it the adoption?
Emily, can you help us get back to
little tap dance through the slides?
All right. Technology doesn't always cooperate.
And I had touched on that earlier. I think we all did pretty well. It's, how are we executing to keep moving to the next step, gain adoption, educate the team, and maintain day-to-day operations. And something we've seen, and this is even in the incentivized world, everybody wants to do it themselves, which is understandable, but sometimes that can slow things down or lead to errors and mistakes. So, one of the key things we found to be very successful in executing a plan is, first, in the planning phase, educating the team. So whether that's during the assessment or right following the assessment, as I had alluded to earlier, teaching the team to fish. Because you're going to have folks that need to learn some stuff, may not be open, or may not have shared that they need to learn it, but really in a subtle approach, while building out and executing on a pilot, we're working with partners that are not trying to silo themselves out and capture business, but that are working in parallel and hand in hand with your team to teach them the best practices and the right approach while executing on something. I think that's the key approach. So while completing the assessment or at the completion of the assessment, there have been recommendations made based on business priorities, technical use cases, and identification of the lowest hanging fruit based on complexity, level of effort, and risk. Once a pilot is identified, building out that architecture through a series of workshops. In doing so, you're refining that migration plan for both the pilot and a larger scale enterprise execution model. Once those architecture and design workshops are done, you have something to work off of. You're going to have a design guide, a plan forward, and a network architecture with the right governance, subscription modeling, and work group set up for success. Once that is in place, execute on something small. Don't try to boil the ocean right out of the gate, because it becomes cumbersome. It's hard to allocate resources to that, and the success rate is lower. So execute on something that's manageable and achievable, and build that repeatable framework based on those results. As you continue down the path of executing additional waves that may be increasing in complexity or size, you're able to work with a partner and or now leverage educated resources internally to focus on, how are we managing this environment, both from a security posture perspective and from an operations perspective, as well as an IT administrative angle. And while that's happening, I think Sujay made a really great and salient point. A lot of times people are making the move because someone said they really need to, because cloud is hot, or there's a real cost driver or compliance driver. Once in the cloud, that's when the real opportunity happens. Hey, this is really a good platform. There are all these services and capabilities available to us. How are we then learning about them, applying them, and optimizing our environment to really hit the three key buttons that everyone's responsible for? How are we mitigating risk? How are we increasing revenue or margin? Or how are we in some way, shape, or form lowering cost? And by following this approach, and I think you can do it multiple times over the course of an enterprise migration, you're going to have repeatable success. You're going to increase adoption across your team because they're learning and doing at the same time, while also, when it makes sense, leveraging a partner to help enable those activities and also be solely focused on completion of that. So what are often very lean IT staffs are able to execute on the day-to-day operations as well. So that would kind of be the summary of that at a high level.
Yeah, I agree with what Kirk said about partner networks being willing and able to actually teach the services and teach the little things to other IT staff that might not have the expertise in this area. We've certainly had clients who we've helped migrate over to the cloud, established great automated tools, and made use of so many AWS managed services that after a certain time, they have in-house staff that is now experts in the topic. So they use us more as consulting partners rather than handling the day-to-day operations. So it's just an evolution of how the cloud behavior operates once you migrate over. So Kurt, great point there.
Hey, Sujay, you want to talk a little bit about how speaking of migrating, right? You want to talk us through the migrate step?
Yeah, absolutely. This is kind of where it's going to get super deep into AWS land. So Kurt, jump in also at any point. Just tell us about the features that Azure offers as well. That'd be great for the whole crowd here. But at Privo, I think we like to go with the motto of do it now so you don't have to worry about it later, which just means that we deploy secure workloads from the get-go that make use of key components to make an infrastructure secure and also scalable and mainly compliant, because we have a ton of clients in the life sciences industry, in the healthcare industry, in the financial services industry. So security and compliance is super big for them. So by default, we just roll out the same environment for any of our clients because you never know when the requirements are going to come up at any point. And we also love moving our clients from traditional architectural practices into more cloud native solutions like AWS managed services, containers, serverless architecture, all wrapped around infrastructure as code, which we'll get into in just a second. But some of the services that are offered on AWS that can be leveraged to take your application to the next level that we've been talking about is KMS. So KMS is Key Management Store. We've already talked about encrypting disk on-prem and how some of us have probably faced that and found that to be a pain. But KMS offers, seamless encryption with AWS and customer managed keys. So it makes it easier for us to pick and choose exactly which key we want to use. You almost always want to go with the customer managed key because of the flexibility that it offers. But AWS managed key also works. With customer managed keys, you also get to rotate it every year, so you don't have to worry about that from a compliance perspective. And encryption in transit. AWS offers a service called Amazon Certificate Manager, which essentially gives you free SSL certificates every year and has the ability, which is my favorite part actually, to be able to renew automatically every year. Just coming from a background of having to manage all of that stuff, having this all automatically done is a win in my books. ACM integrates with load balancers and CloudFront distribution. So, it just works great with layer 7 HTTP and HTTPS traffic. Talked about serverless compute just a little bit, but having the ability to run your code, not on physical servers where you have to maintain the operating system, do patching and updates and stuff like that. And being able to actually run it on a serverless architecture is also provided by AWS, which can be super helpful for a lot of clients who are trying to have less management burden. IAM and security. IAM stands for Identity Access Management, which gives you a centralized console to be able to control access to your AWS resources, be it console access or CLI access. It also integrates with SAML2, and SSO is also available. And one cool thing, again, compliance and security, you are able to enforce MFA across the board for all of your users using IAM. So it has seamless integration there as well. And all of this is wrapped around infrastructure as code. We'll talk about the primary infrastructure as codes that are available in the market right now, the most popular ones that are used across the board by a lot of clients in just a second. But having this all wrapped around infrastructure as code helps us to have a scalable and also maintain a secure and compliant environment in templates and modules, whether it's one resource or 1,000 of them. Raf, could you move on to the next slide? Yeah.
Hey, as we jump from one slide to the next, just something really quick to add. And I know if you've been in security long enough, this is just a chuckle. But Sujay, you mentioned expiring certificates. I can't tell you how many organizations, including security tools, have fallen to the problem of, oops, the SSL cert that we had or the HTTPS cert that we had expired, right? That happens so often, it's ridiculous. And the ability to automatically have that renewed and taken care of, I can't stress the value of something like that.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's probably one of my favorite features about ACM. Kirk, you had something?
Yeah, great insight. And I think with Armor as having the ability to work across clouds and awareness both from an AWS and Azure perspective, there's a lot to learn. And Sujay made great points. There are opportunities to really drive through an SLA through your partners and your cloud provider. The higher you move up the stack, the more they're responsible in maintaining that security posture, and you have the right experts. The other component, considering just the critical mass of information and kind of a lot of similar capabilities available across cloud platforms, take advantage of the opportunities available from the cloud providers that are working with these partners to get educated, right? So if you're involved in some sort of assessment, be it Azure or AWS, you're working with a partner, that partner has been through a lot of vetting through that provider. And if you're at a certain phase of your migration and those areas become important, do things like MTCs. There's a different term for them with AWS. Go on site, work with the partner, spend a day or two in workshops and really refine what the best path is. And it really helps bring your team along. And again, the biggest driver, I think, to making these things happen is helping folks learn and understand so that they're willing and able and open to adoption. And when that happens, everyone is successful. And I know those things are available across all cloud platforms, so take advantage of them for sure.
Yeah, and one of the other things is, we see clients that go from on-premises to the cloud all the time, right? So there's different requirements that come up all the time. So it's instead of spending a lot of time trying to figure out a custom solution that is going to work for you, just reaching out to a partner. I'm sure Kirk has seen a ton of situations that apply to a lot of different clients. So we've probably implemented a solution that instead of spending a lot of hours in-house to figure out, reaching out to a partner who might already have a pre-baked solution and it's like ready to implement can also save a ton of time.
Absolutely.
Cool. So let's move along in the interest of time here because we do have we've got still a lot of material to cover. Next slide, please.
Yeah. So before we jump into infrastructure as code, really, could you go back to the previous slide there? Thank you. Yeah. So before we jump in fully how infrastructure as code can really help us with our migrations, quickly about what infrastructure as code actually is. No matter how many migrations we really do, paramount to success is really going to come from consistency across the board and also preparations, which we've talked about a lot today. So when you're dealing with workloads that can contain sensitive information, going from one environment to another, it needs to be vetted and also predictable every single time. So how do we ensure that consistency of security and configuration is maintained across the board, right? And with a team that's maintaining it with differing backgrounds and different solutions to problems that they might possibly have. Documentation is great. Yeah, we can maintain a specific document that goes over every single service and how it's maintained and operated. But how do we open up new issues? How do we find out there's problems with it, and how do we contribute together? That's where infrastructure as code comes into play. Two of the most commonly used infrastructure as code, at least with AWS and other cloud providers, is CloudFormation, which is AWS native, and Terraform, which is cloud agnostic. Both work similarly. You create templates and modules to deploy your resources. So in our case, in the simplest form, CloudFormation, we're essentially creating a bucket, an S3 bucket. We have our bucket name specified, encryption enforced because security, right? And we have logging configured. So any requests that are coming into that bucket, going to another bucket. We'll leave the versioning part disabled for now, and then talk about tags. So just setting some initial tags on that S3 bucket. Boom, you launch the stack, you have an S3 bucket created. One of the good things about this is what we've done is we've effectively produced an auditable and documented infrastructure. So when there's an external auditor coming in and asking you about how your S3 bucket was configured, you have a template that you can point to and say, hey, this is how I enforce my security, even on my S3 buckets. So how does CloudFormation work? You have your buckets spun out. There's a requirement for versioning to be enabled. Versioning is a feature in S3 where essentially it keeps copies of your data. So if you have a PDF file, version 1 of that PDF file was modified, you save it and then upload it to S3 again, same file name. So it keeps both versions of your file. So anytime that you want to go back and track your changes, it's still available for you. Do you just tear down the whole S3 bucket to enable versioning, or just do it manually, or do you just update the stack? The answer is you just update the stack. You go and add that property, and that's how CloudFormation or Terraform or any infrastructure as code that you might use is super helpful, essentially, because you can maintain your state across multiple environments. On the other hand, Terraform, we're creating a route table and just associating with the subnet and a VPC in this case. One cool thing about Terraform being cloud agnostic is once you've developed and you've deployed an infrastructure using Terraform, you have one code base that can basically be migrated over to Azure or Google Cloud Platform or whatever platforms you're migrating to in the future. But you have one code base that can basically be applied to them all, or at least the concepts of it can be applied to them all. So I would definitely recommend looking at infrastructure as code more in detail and how it can actually help you with migrations. And it kind of gets interesting at this point, right? As Raf, if we can go on to the next slide. Great, thank you. So at this point, we're working on one resource, we're deploying it, but how do we scale out our infrastructure? We have it deployed across one account, maybe one region, but we want to scale out. We want to have an environment-specific account. And on AWS, it's kind of cool. You don't pay for the total number of accounts that you have. You only pay for the resources. So you can have a dedicated development, a dedicated staging, a dedicated production account. So you keep your resources isolated. That way, you can prevent any human error in the future. And just like any code, infrastructure as code can also be version control using Bitbucket or GitHub. So now you've essentially introduced collaboration amongst your teams. We can use things like branch protection to put on new enhancements for review, or create issues for a team to collaborate and squash bugs. So as you start seeing, developing infrastructure as code becomes very similar to like developing web apps. We can move on, Raf. Great. We'll go back to the 3-tier architecture just in a second. But now we have a predictable environment that we can migrate to because you've defined how your infrastructure is deployed using infrastructure as code. So rather than having the content really mold to the infrastructure, rather than having the infrastructure mold to the content can actually mold to the infrastructure. So you make sure that the application that you're developing, all the services that you're developing are secure and are compliant because you've made sure that your infrastructure is like that. So what does this look like? That model, that VPC network diagram is essentially a 3-tier model. So we have 2 different availability zones for high availability. We have 3 different subnets. So a public subnet spanning across 2 AZs, a private subnet spanning across 2 AZs, availability zones, and a data subnet that spans across 2 availability zones as well. Public subnet backed by an internet gateway. So you have access to ingress and egress to the internet. There's a public IP there, so you can ping it or go grab YUM updates, etc. Private subnet backed by a NAT gateway. So there's no ingress from the internet, only egress. So your web servers or any EC2 instances that you deploy will live in this private subnet to be able to just communicate out, but no external access, again, enforcing security. And your database, on the other hand, is in a data subnet where there's no ingress or egress to the internet. Ideally, if you're on AWS, you are using RDS for your database, which is a fully managed database service where AWS takes care of patching, applying security updates, different things like that. So there's no actual database management work going on other than, managing your queries and whatnot. So the database subnet only locked down to internal access. There are other AWS services that are mentioned on there. Just in the interest of time, we probably don't have to cover other than CloudTrail, which is a AWS security service that ties into Armor. CloudTrail monitors every single API activity that happens against your AWS account, be it console activity or CLI activity, and logs all of it. And that can be shipped over to Armor for predicting and analyzing. And for an analysis on security events. VPC flow logs are logs that are of events that are happening against your VPC and your resources in your VPC. So if you have a web server running, you can get finer details even of what public IP reached my server, what response did my server give out, how long the request took, etc. And guard duty, intelligent intrusion detection service. It essentially learns your account over time. It's kind of cool, and also it can predict if it's an activity that is yours or somebody else's if your account is compromised ever. So those are cool things that actually tie into Armor as well. And Raf, if you want to speak to how Armor can be useful there, that'd be awesome.
Sure.
Actually, I'm going to cut in here. This is Emily Gedkin again, the moderator of the webinar. In the interest of time, we're actually going to go ahead and skip ahead to questions that you may have. So if you haven't already submitted your questions, please feel free to use the question function to submit them now. And while you're submitting your questions, I'll go ahead and let Kirk and Raf speak to the rest of migration here. And at the end of the webinar, we will send out the whole deck so that you have access to the information of the last tip as well.
Very cool. That's right. Kirk, you want to talk about Migrate real quick, and I'll add some color to it as well while folks are thinking about questions.
Absolutely. I think if we break this down, and it's really building off of what's been touched on earlier in the conversation. And we've assessed the environment, we've built a business case, we've done a series of pilots and/or POCs to build the appropriate execution plan. In parallel, have established the right governance and framework within the cloud of choice or clouds of choice. And then how are we executing? And I think what I'd mentioned earlier is, assess and reassess as you execute. And through the migration plan or action of migration, making sure that the right stakeholders are engaged across application teams, infrastructure teams, and security are critical. And once something is deployed, always reevaluate. A common statement from our clients is once an architecture is established, it changes. So with that in mind, how are you staying aligned with and evaluating and validating everything that's deployed so that you're building off of that result and adapting as needed? And upon execution, I think, as I said before, if you're taking an approach where you're not boiling the ocean, taking that phased approach will result in a higher rate of success and continued modernization, optimization as you execute. So that would kind of be the high level.
Yeah, cool. And I guess, to add some security code to that, we're, from an Armor perspective, help you along the way. Migration is not a gentle, simple thing often. And knowing that you have a single security posture, single security operations structure, package, and delivery model, whether it's on-prem, Google, Microsoft, or Amazon consistently, is something that you can definitely depend on. And that's kind of what we've built the business around, being able to be consistent, being able to provide that uniformity across those clouds. And so I guess we'll skip the final question here, but I'll add a little bit of color to optimize, and then we'll get to questions. But from an optimized perspective, folks, it's all about knowing what you want to be able to do. What you're trying to continually improve. There's no such thing as deployed and done. Those days are gone. So look at, from a security perspective, as your organization continues to leverage new services, as the cloud providers continue to deploy new security and operational services and components and and all these various moving parts and deployment strategies and tools and such, make sure you're always staying ahead of it. That's probably the one thing that I would tell you is be able to measure it. If you can't measure success, if you can't measure your path forward and whether you're good or bad, and you have to be able to tell yourself, are you good, are you bad, are you getting better, are you getting worse, how do you define those, then it's going to be a real hard struggle. All right, Emily, you want to talk to your questions?
Absolutely. So our first question is, does the cloud I'm moving to influence the advice that you gave today?
I'll take that one and take that one real quick and just add that I think overall the public cloud providers have different ways of executing on the concepts that we talked today, but overall the strategy stays the same. Kirk, CJ, you guys agree with that?
Yep.
Yes.
Love it.
We're keeping it short.
I was stuck on mute there for a sec, like I was shouting to a deaf audience.
Emily, anything else?
Yeah, we had one more. Someone asked, once I've started the process of migrating into the cloud, is it possible to go back to on-prem, or would you kind of continue pressing forward?
I would continue pressing forward, just because of the fact that, it's great on premises, but it's still, at this point in 2019, it feels like it's a little bit of an older technology and legacy, if you want to call it that. So identify your tools. I mean, a lot of services are provided by different cloud providers. So if your first step was not the greatest and you're not happy with that cloud provider, look into the other options that are available and talk to some people and see what pain points you guys are having right now, and then try to identify how you can solve those things.
Yeah, absolutely agree. At a fundamental level, the technologies are there, the processes are there, the tools are there. Get the team on board, and if there's an experience that didn't turn out as expected or to the level of satisfaction or metric that you were aiming for, deep dive on that. Understand if it was, where in the process or the people or the technology things fell short, and adapt accordingly. And there are, different capabilities and services, and that coupled with preference typically will lead to a better result. We haven't seen a lot of people abandon the cloud. Anytime it's happened, it's typically been driven by some sort of political resistance or something that had nothing to do with the technology itself.
And that's a great place to end it, folks. So thanks for bearing with us in terms of running over just a little bit. Emily, you got any last minute housekeeping items here?
Absolutely. I would love to ask all attendees to participate in the quick survey that will be sent out after the broadcast. Your feedback is really valuable. If you'd like to attend any more webinars or other Armor events, please visit armor.com/events. Raf, Kirk, and Sujay, I'd like to thank you for joining us on today's broadcast and sharing your expertise with our attendees. Sincerest of thank yous to everyone for joining us, and we look forward to hosting you again.
Thanks, everybody. We appreciate you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye-bye.